Hello, book lovers. Welcome back to our guided reading sessions of Charlotte Bronte's The Professor. We are now in session 9. We are almost at the end of this journey. Last time it was a long session, so we ended up reading chapters 19 and 20. So today we're going to read chapters 21, 22, and 23. But before we do that, let's catch up. Let's think about what we discussed last time. So we read that Mademoiselle Henri, Frances Henri, had left the pensionnat without any warning to William, and he started looking for her everywhere since she left without giving an address, or the directress kept the address secret from him. And eventually he found her. After weeks looking for her everywhere in Brussels, he found her at the cemetery. Her aunt had died. And there and then he realizes why he loves Frances. Her discretion, forethought, diligence, perseverance, self-denial, self-control, truth, honor, independence, conscientiousness, tenderness, natural feeling, natural passion. These are the words that he uses to describe his feelings for her. And it's quite telling, right? It's not about how she looks, it's about who she is on the inside and how she fights for what she believes. She perseveres and diligent and has self-control. So the kind of qualities that William praises. At the end of this reunion, there's a storm, a very heavy storm. So William comes to her house, and her house mirrors her personality. The house is poor, but clean and neat. And William really appreciates that. He even feels sorry for her and for her poverty now that she has lost her income at the pensionnat and that her aunt died. So she has to rely on herself. She has to live very conscientiously. She has to save money. So the fire was not lit. She only lit it while he was there. And he noticed that she only used tea and sugar and milk because he was there, because these are luxuries that she couldn't afford on a daily basis anymore. And that breaks his heart. He also at the moment realizes that he wishes to build a home. And looking at her there at that moment, speaking English, and she wanted to show off her English china that William said, well, it looks like England 100 years ago. But drinking tea, speaking English, it kind of created the illusion of a cozy English home for him. And he realized that's what he wanted to build, and he wanted Frances as his wife, but the feeling had to be mutual. And since Frances was poor, well, he had to find a way to be able to provide for himself and her. And at that point, he did not have that. But on leaving her house, he sees a rainbow. And a rainbow is, of course, very symbolic. It symbolizes happiness, joy. And on that night, he dreams of an angel. So he interprets those two signs as a sign of hope that he should endure, that he would be successful or rewarded in the end. His relationship with Pelé becomes cold because the directress, Mademoiselle Reuter, had fallen in love with William. The more he shunned her, the more she became fascinated by him, and Monsieur Pelé found out. And then the relationship between Pelé and William could no longer stand, and William really wanted to be a free man again. Similar feeling to what he had felt when he was working for his brother at Aix. He wanted to be a free man again, especially when Mademoiselle Reuter regained Monsieur Pelet's affection, and they were preparing everything to get married and for Mademoiselle Reuter, who then would become Madame Pelé, to move to the house. So he needed to leave the house. He could not live in the same place as Mademoiselle Reuter. And he even said that he was afraid he'd fall under temptation if they lived under the same roof, that it would become a sort of French novel, which kind of surprises me because he would not have, well, maybe that is why, he would not have the kind of self-control and moral qualities that he appreciates in Francis. But eventually, he gave a week's notice to leave Monsieur Pelet's pensionnat, so he would also be jobless. And he followed his conscience and rejected temptation. This is where we left off. So now we're going to read chapters 21, 22, and 23. So let's get started. Chapter 21. Directly as I closed the door, I saw laid on the table 2 letters. My thought was that they were notes of invitation from the friends of some of my pupils. I had received such marks of attention occasionally, and with me, who had no friends, correspondence of more interest was out of the question. The postman's arrival had never yet been an event of interest to me since I came to Brussels. I laid my hand carelessly on the documents, and coldly and slowly glancing at them, I prepared to break the seals. My eye was arrested, and my hand too. I saw what excited me, as if I had found a vivid picture where I expected only to discover a blank page. On one cover was an English postmark, on the other a lady's clear, fine autograph. The last I opened first. And this is the letter. Monsieur, I found out what you had done the very morning after your visit to me. You might be sure I should dust the china every day, and as no one but you had been in my room for a week, and as ferry money is not current in Brussels, I could not doubt who left the 20 francs on the chimney-piece. I thought I heard you stir the vase when I was stooping to look for your glove under the table, and I wondered you should imagine it had got into such a little cup. Now, monsieur, the money is not mine, and I shall not keep it. I will not send it in this note because it might be lost. Besides, it is heavy. But I will restore it to you the first time I see you, and you must make no difficulties about taking it, because in the first place, I am sure, monsieur, you can understand that one likes to pay one's debts, that it is satisfactory to owe no man anything. And in the second place, I can now very well afford to be honest, as I am provided with a situation. This last circumstance is indeed the reason of my writing to you, for it is pleasant to communicate good news. And in these days I have only my master to whom I can tell anything. A week ago, monsieur, I was sent for by a Mrs. Wharton, an English lady. Her eldest daughter was going to be married, and some rich relation having made her a present of a veil and dress in costly old lace, as precious, they said, almost as jewels, but a little damaged by time, I was commissioned to put them in repair. I had to do it at the house. They gave me besides some embroidery to complete, and nearly a week elapsed before I had finished everything. While I worked, Miss Wharton often came into the room and sat with me, and so did Mrs. Wharton. They made me talk English, asked how I had learned to speak it so well. Then they inquired what I knew besides, what books I had read. Soon they seemed to make a sort of wonder of me, considering me, no doubt, as a learned grisette. And now this is an interesting word, grisette, in French, right? It's a word used not anymore, but used for a French working class woman. And gris is, of course, gray in French, and it refers to the color of their cheap clothes. So a working class woman would be referred to as grisette. So she writes, considering me no doubt as a learned grisette. One afternoon, Mrs. Wharton brought in a Parisian lady to test the accuracy of my knowledge of French. The result of it was that, owing probably in a great degree to the mother's and daughter's good humor about the marriage, which inclined them to be beneficent, to do beneficent deeds, And partly, I think, because they are naturally benevolent people, they decided that the wish I had expressed to do something more than mend lace was a very legitimate one. And the same day they took me in their carriage to Mrs. D's, who is the directress of the first English school at Brussels. It seems she happened to be in want of a French lady to give lessons in geography, history, grammar, and composition in the French language. Mrs. Wharton recommended me very warmly, and as two of her younger daughters are pupils in the house, her patronage availed to get me the place. It was settled that I am to attend 6 hours daily. For happily it was not required that I should live in the house. I should have been very sorry to leave my lodgings. And for this Mrs. D will give me 1,200 francs per annum. You see, therefore, monsieur, that I am now rich, richer almost than I ever hoped to be. I feel thankful for it, especially as my sight was beginning to be injured by constant working at fine lace, and I was getting too very weary of sitting up late at nights, and yet not being able to find time for reading or study. I began to fear that I should fall ill and be unable to pay my way. This fear is now in a great measure removed, and in truth, monsieur, I am very grateful to God for the relief. And I feel it necessary almost to speak of my happiness to someone who is kind-hearted enough to derive joy from seeing others joyful. I could not, therefore, resist the temptation of writing to you. I argued with myself, it is very pleasant for me to write, and it will not be exactly painful, though it may be tiresome to monsieur to read. Do not be too angry with my circumlocution and inelegancies of expression, and believe me, your attached pupil, F.E. Henri. So she sent him a letter. Having read this letter, I mused on its contents for a few moments, whether with sentiments pleasurable or otherwise, I will hereafter note, and then took up the other. It was directed in a hand to me unknown, small and rather neat, neither masculine nor exactly feminine. The seal bore a coat of arms, concerning which I could only decipher that it was not that of the Seacombe family. Consequently, the apostle could be from none of my almost forgotten, and certainly quite forgetting patrician relations. From whom then was it? I removed the envelope. The note folded within ran as follows. So let's take a look at the second letter he received. I have no doubt in the world that you are doing well in that greasy Flanders, living probably on the fat of the unctuous land, sitting like a black-haired, tawny-skinned, long-nosed Israelite by the flesh-pots of Egypt, or like a rascally son of Levi near the brass cauldrons of the sanctuary, and every now and then plunging in a consecrated hook and drawing out of the sea of broth the fattest of heave shoulders and the fleshiest of wave breasts. I know this because you never write to anyone in England, thankless dog that you are. I, by the sovereign efficacy of my recommendation, got you the place where you are now living in clover, and yet not a word of gratitude or even acknowledgment have you ever offered in return. But I am coming to see you, and small conception can you, with your adult aristocratic brains, form of the sort of moral kicking I have ready packed in my carpet bag, destined to be presented to you immediately on my arrival. Meantime, I know all about your affairs and have just got information by Brown's last letter that you are said to be on the point of forming an advantageous match with a pursy little Belgian schoolmistress, a Mademoiselle Zenobie or some such name. Won't I have a look at her when I come over? And this you may rely on. If she pleases my taste, or if I think it worthwhile in a pecuniary point of view, I'll pounce on your prize and bear her away triumphant in spite of your teeth. Yet I don't like dumpies either, and Brown says she's little and stout, the better fitted for a wiry, starved-looking chap like you. Be on the lookout, for you know neither the day nor hour when I don't wish to blaspheme, so I'll leave a blank, cometh. Yours truly, Hunston York Hunston. Remember Mr. Hunston from the very beginning of the novel, that very peculiar man who was in his brother's um, birthday party and saw the way that Edward had treated William and said that he was against all tyranny in the world, and he had helped William find a place to work in Belgium. and he's writing to say he'll come to see him because he has not received a word of thanks from William. So I'm curious to see him back in the picture because he was quite a unique character. And he even says that um, rumor has it that William will be marrying um, a Belgian directress, Miss Mademoiselle Zenobie or such name. He was actually referring to Mademoiselle uh, Reuter, Zoraide, right? But that's not true, right? He's not marrying her. Said I, and ere I laid the letter down, I again glanced at the small, neat handwriting, not a bit like that of a mercantile man, nor indeed of any except Hunsden himself. They talk of affinities between the autograph and the character. What affinity was there here? I recall the writer's peculiar face and certain traits I suspected, rather than knew, to appertain to his nature, and I answered, a great deal. Hunsden then was coming to Brussels, and coming I knew not when. Coming charged with the expectation of finding me on the summit of prosperity, about to be married, to step into a warm nest, to lie comfortably down by the side of a snug, well-fed little maid. I wish him joy of the fidelity of the picture he has painted, thought I. What will he say when, instead of a pair of plump turtle doves, billing and cooing in a bower of roses, he finds a single lean cormorant standing mateless and shelterless on poverty's bleak cliff? Oh, confound him! Let him come, and let him laugh at the contrast between rumor and fact. Were he the devil himself, instead of being merely very like him, I'd not condescend to get out of his way, or to forge a smile or a cheerful word wherewith to avert his sarcasm. Then I recurred to the other letter. That struck a chord whose sound I could not deaden by thrusting my fingers into my ears, for it vibrated within, and though its swell might be exquisite music, its cadence was a groan. That Frances was relieved from the pressure of want, that the curse of excessive labor was taken off her, filled me with happiness. That her first thought in prosperity should be to augment her joy by sharing it with me, met and satisfied the wish of my heart. Two results of her letter were then pleasant, sweet as two draughts of nectar. But applying my lips for the third time to the cup, and they were excoriated as with vinegar and gall. Two persons whose desires are moderate may live well enough in Brussels on an income which would scarcely afford a respectable maintenance for one in London. So you could live well in Brussels with a lot less money than you would need to live a comfortable life in London. And that not because the necessaries of life are so much dearer in the latter capital, or taxes so much higher than in the former, but because the English surpass in folly all the nations on God's earth, and are more abject slaves to custom, to opinion, to the desire to keep up a certain appearance, than the Italians are to priestcraft, the French to vainglory, the Russians to their czar, or the Germans to black beer. I have seen a degree of sense in the modest arrangement of one homely Belgian household that might put to shame the elegance, the superfluities, the luxuries, the strange refinements of 100 genteel English mansions. In Belgium, provided you can make money, you may save it. This is scarcely possible in England. Ostentation there lavishes in a month what industry has earned in a year. More shame to all classes in that most bountiful and beggarly country for their servile following of fashion with a capital F. So here he's criticizing the English, right, who pay money to follow fashion with a capital F. So for superfluous things and to show off, to pay for ostentation. And that's something that he does not find in Belgium. So he appreciates the what's the word he uses? The modest arrangement of a homely place in Belgium. I could write a chapter or two on this subject, but must forbear, at least for the present. Had I retained my £60 per annum, I could, now that Frances was in possession of 50, have gone straight to her this very evening and spoken out the words which, repressed, kept fretting my heart with fever. Our united income would, as we should have managed it, have sufficed well for our mutual support. Since we lived in a country where economy was not confounded with meanness, where frugality in dress, food, and furniture was not synonymous with vulgarity in these various points. But the placeless usher, bare of resource and unsupported by connections, must not think of this. Such a sentiment as love, such a word as marriage, were misplaced in his heart and on his lips. So now he thinks, had he only not left his position at Monsieur Pelle's, then he could go straight to Frances and ask her to marry him because their combined incomes would be sufficient for the two of them. But alas, he does not have that anymore. Now, for the first time, did I truly feel what it was to be poor. Now did the sacrifice I had made in casting from me the means of living put on a new aspect. Instead of a correct, just, honorable act, it seemed a deed at once light and fanatical. I took several turns in my room under the goading influence of most poignant remorse. I walked a quarter of an hour from the wall to the window, and at the window self-reproach seemed to face me. At the wall, self-disdain. All at once out spoke conscience. Down, stupid tormentors, cried she, conscience with a capital C. The man has done his duty. You shall not bait him thus by thoughts of what might have been. He relinquished a temporary and contingent good to avoid a permanent and certain evil. He did well. Let him reflect now, and when your blinding dust and deafening hum subside, he will discover a path. I sat down. I propped my forehead on both my hands. I thought and thought an hour, 2 hours. Vainly. I seemed like one sealed in a subterranean vault, who gazes at utter blackness, at blackness ensured by yard-thick stone walls around and by piles of building above, expecting light to penetrate through granite and through cement firm as granite. But there are chinks, or there may be chinks, in the best adjusted masonry. There was a chink in my cavernous cell, for eventually I saw, or seemed to see, a ray, pallid indeed, and cold, and doubtful, but still a ray, for it showed that narrow path which conscience had promised after 2-3 hours' torturing research in brain and memory. I disinterred certain remains of circumstances and conceived a hope that by putting them together an expedient might be framed and a resource discovered. The circumstances were briefly this. Some 3 months ago, Monsieur Pellet had, on the occasion of his fête, given the boys a treat, which treat consisted in a party of pleasure to a certain place of public resort in the outskirts of Brussels, of which I do not at this moment remember the name, but near it were several of those lakelets called étangs, like small lakes, right? And there was one étang, one small lake, larger than the rest, where on holidays people were accustomed to amuse themselves by rowing round it in little boats. The boys, having eaten an unlimited quantity of gaufres and drank several bottles of Louvain beer, amid the shades of a garden made and provided for such crams, petitioned the director for leave to take a row on the étang. Half a dozen of the eldest succeeded in obtaining leave, and I was commissioned to accompany them as surveillant. Among the half dozen happened to be a certain Jean-Baptiste van den Houten, a most ponderous young Flamand, not tall, but even now, at the early age of 16, possessing a breadth and depth of personal development truly national. It chanced that Jean was the first lad to step into the boat. He stumbled, rolled to one side, the boat revolted at his weight and capsized. Van den Houten sank like lead, rose, sank again. My coat and waistcoat were off in an instant. I had not been brought up at Eton and boated and bathed and swam there 10 long years for nothing. It was a natural and easy act for me to leap to the rescue. The lads and the boatmen yelled. They thought there would be 2 deaths by drowning instead of 1. But as Jean rose the 3rd time, I clutched him by one leg and the collar, and in 3 minutes more both he and I were safe landed. To speak heaven's truth, my merit in the action was small indeed, for I had run no risk, and subsequently did not even catch cold from the wetting. But when Monsieur and Madame van den Hutton, of whom Jean Baptiste was the sole hope, came to hear of the exploit, they seemed to think I had evinced a bravery and devotion which no thanks could sufficiently repay. Madame, in particular, was certain I must have dearly loved their sweet son, or I would not thus have hazarded my own life to save his. Monsieur, an honest-looking, though phlegmatic man, said very little, but he would not suffer me to leave the room till I had promised that in case I ever stood in need of help, I would, by applying to him, give him a chance of discharging the obligation under which he affirmed I had laid him. These words then were my glimmer of light. It was here I found my sole outlet, and in truth, though the cold light roused, it did not cheer me. Nor did the outlet seem such as I should like to pass through. Right I had none Monsieur Monsieur van den Hutten's good offices. It was not on the ground of merit I could apply to him. No, I must stand on that of necessity. I had no work. I wanted work. My best chance of obtaining it lay in securing his recommendation. This I knew could be had by asking for it. Not to ask, because the request revolted my pride and contradicted my habits, would, I felt, be an indulgence of false and indolent fastidiousness. I might repent the omission all my life. I would not then be guilty of it. That evening I went to Monsieur van den Hutten's, but I had bent the bow and adjusted the shaft in vain. The string broke. I rang the bell at the great door. It was a large, handsome house in an expensive part of the town. A manservant opened. I asked for Monsieur van den Hutton. Monsieur van den Hutton and family were all out of town, gone to Ostend, did not know when they would be back. I left my card and retraced my steps. And this is the end of chapter 21. So William remembers something that had happened 3 months prior, and he had saved the life of a boy, one of the boys at school. And his father was and mother, they were very obliged to William for having saved their son. And the man had said that if ever he needed anything, he would be glad to help. So he thought of calling on this favor, even though he did not like to have to do that. But his state of necessity was so much that he would do that against his pride. But he goes there, and the family was out. So that ray of hope gets dark again. So let's see if he will manage to find something. Let's continue with chapter 22. A week is gone. Le jour de noces, that means the nuptials night, so the wedding. Le jour de noces arrived. The marriage was solemnized at Saint-Jacques. Mademoiselle Zoraide became Madame Pellet, no Reuter, and in about an hour after this transformation, the happy pair, as newspapers phrase it, were on their way to Paris, where, according to previous arrangement, the honeymoon was to be spent. The next day I quitted the pensionnat. Myself and my chattels, some books and clothes, were soon transferred to a modest lodging I had hired in a street not far off. In half an hour my clothes were arranged in a commode, my books on a shelf, and the flitting was effected. I should not have been unhappy that day had not one pang tortured me, a longing to go to the Rue Notre-Dame aux Neiges. That's Francis' address. Resisted, yet irritated by an inward resolve to avoid that street till such time as the mist of doubt should clear from my prospects. It was a sweet September evening, very mild, very still. I had nothing to do. At that hour I knew Frances would be equally released from occupation. I thought she might possibly be wishing for her master. I knew I wished for my pupil. Imagination began with her low whispers, infusing into my soul the soft tale of pleasures that might be. You will find her reading or writing, said she. Imagination with a capital I. So Charlotte Brontë personifies a lot of abstract ideas such as reason, conscience, and now imagination. So imagination is telling him, you will find her reading or writing. You can take your seat at her side. You need not startle her peace by undue excitement. You need not embarrass her manner by unusual action or language. Be as you always are. Look over what she has written. Listen while she reads. Chide her or quietly approve. You know the effect of either system. You know her smile when pleased. You know the play of her looks when roused. You have the secret of awakening that expression. You will and you can choose amongst that pleasant variety. With you, she will sit silent as long as it suits you to talk alone. You can hold her under a potent spell. Intelligent as she is, eloquent as she can be, you can seal her lips and veil her bright countenance with diffidence. Yet, you know, she is not all monotonous mildness. You have seen with a sort of strange pleasure, revolt, scorn, austerity, bitterness, lay energetic claim to a place in her feelings and physiognomy. You know that few could rule her as you do. You know she might break, but never bend under the hand of tyranny and injustice. But reason and affection can guide her by a sign. Try their influence now. Go. They are not passions. You may handle them safely. I will not go, was my answer to the sweet temptress. A man is master of himself to a certain point, but not beyond it. Could I seek Frances tonight? Could I sit with her alone in a quiet room and address her only in the language of reason and affection? No, was the brief, fervent reply of that love which had conquered and now controlled me. Time seemed to stagnate. The sun would not go down. My watch ticked, but I thought the hands were paralyzed. What a hot evening! I cried, throwing open the lattice. For indeed I had seldom felt so feverish. Hearing a step ascending the common stair, I wondered whether the locataire, now mounting to his apartments, were as unsettled in mind and condition as I was, or whether he lived in the calm of certain resources and in the freedom of unfettered feelings. What? Was he coming in person to solve the problem hardly proposed in inaudible thought? He had actually knocked at the door, at my door. A smart, prompt rap. And almost before I could invite him in, he was over the threshold and had closed the door behind him. "And how are you?" asked an indifferent, quiet voice in the English language, while my visitor, without any sort of bustle or introduction, put his hat on the table and his gloves into his hat, and drawing the only armchair the room afforded a little forward, seated himself tranquilly therein. "Can't you speak?" he inquired in a few moments, in a tone whose nonchalance seemed to intimate that it was much the same thing whether I answered or not. The fact is, I found it desirable to have recourse to my good friend's le bicycle, his glasses, not exactly to ascertain the identity of my visitor, for I already knew him, confound his impudence, but to see how he looked, to get a clear notion of his mien and countenance. I wiped the glasses very deliberately, and put them on quite as deliberately, adjusting them so as not to hurt the bridge of my nose or get entangled in my short tufts of dun hair. I was sitting in the window seat with my back to the light, and I had him vis-à-vis, a position he would much rather have had reversed, for at any time he preferred scrutinizing to being scrutinized. Yes, it was he, and no mistake, with his 6 feet of length arranged in a sitting attitude, with his dark traveling surtout with its velvet collar, his grey pantaloons, his black stock, and his face, the most original one nature ever modelled, yet the least obtrusively so. Not one feature that could be termed marked or odd, yet the effect of the whole unique. There is no use in attempting to describe what is undescribable. Being in no hurry to address him, I sat and stared at my ease. "Oh, that's your game, is it?" said he at last. "Well, we'll see which one is soonest tired." And he slowly drew out a fine cigar case, picked one to his taste, lit it, took a book from the shelf convenient to his hand, then leaning back, proceeded to smoke and read as tranquilly as if he had been in his own room in Grove Street, X, shire, England. So it was, of course, Mr. Hunsden. I knew he was capable of continuing that attitude till midnight if he conceived the whim, so I rose, and taking the book from his hand, I said, "You did not ask for it, and you shall not have it. It is silly and dull. he observed, so I have not lost much. Then, the spell being broken, he went on. I thought you lived at Pilate's. I went there this afternoon expecting to be starved to death by sitting in a boarding school drawing room, and they told me you were gone, had departed this morning. You had left your address behind you, though, which I wondered at. It was a more practical and sensible precaution than I should have imagined you capable of. Why did you leave? Because Monsieur Pelet has just married the lady whom you and Mr. Brown assigned to me as my wife. Oh, indeed, replied Hunsden with a short laugh. So you've lost both your wife and your place. Precisely so. I saw him give a quick, covert glance all round my room. He marked its narrow limits, its scanty furniture. In an instant he had comprehended the state of matters, had absolved me from the crime of prosperity. A curious effect this discovery wrought in his strange mind. I am morally certain that if he had found me installed in a handsome parlor, lounging on a soft couch, with a pretty wealthy wife at my side, he would have hated me. A brief cold haughty visit would in such a case have been the extreme limit of his civilities, and never would he have come near me more, so long as the tide of fortune bore me smoothly on its surface. But the painted furniture, the bare walls, the cheerless solitude of my room relaxed his rigid pride, and I know not what softening change had taken place both in his voice and look ere he spoke again. You have got another place? No. You are in the way of getting one? No. That is bad. Have you applied to Brown? No, indeed. You had better. He often has it in his power to give useful information in such matters. He served me once very well. I have no claim on him and am not in the humor to bother him again. Oh, if you're bashful and dread being intrusive, you need only commission me. I shall see him tonight. I can put in a word. I beg you will not, Mr. Hunsden. I am in your debt already. You did me an important service when I was at X, got me out of a den where I was dying. That service I have never repaid, and at present I decline positively adding another item to the account. If the wind sits that way, I'm satisfied. I thought my unexampled generosity in turning you out of that accursed counting-house would be duly appreciated some day. Cast your bread on the waters, and it shall be found after many days, say the scriptures. Yes, that's right, lad. Make much of me. I am a non-pareil. There's nothing like me in the common herd. In the meantime, to pull all humbug aside and talk sense for a few moments, you would be greatly the better of a situation, and what is more, you are a fool if you refuse to take one from any hand that offers it. Very well, Mr. Hunsden, now you have settled that point, talk of something else. What news from X? I have not settled that point, or at least there is another to settle before we get to X. Is this Miss Zenobie? Zoraide, interposed I. Well, Zoraide, is she really married to Pelet? I tell you yes, and if you don't believe me, go and ask the curé of Saint-Jacques. And your heart is broken? I am not aware that it is. It feels all right, beats as usual. Then your feelings are less superfine than I took them to be. You must be a coarse, callous character to bear such a thwack without staggering under it. Staggering under it. What the deuce is there to stagger under in the circumstance of a Belgian schoolmistress marrying a French schoolmaster? The progeny will doubtless be a strange hybrid race, but that's their lookout, not mine. He indulges in scurrilous jests, and the bride was his affianced once. Who said so? Brown? I'll tell you what, Hunsden, Brown is an old gossip. He is. But in the meantime, if his gossip be founded on less than fact, if you took no particular interest in Miss Zoraide, why, oh youthful pedagogue, did you leave your place in consequence of her becoming Madame Pelet? Because, I felt my face grow a little hot, because, in short, Mr. Hunsden, I decline answering any more questions, and I plunged my hands deep in my breeches pocket. Hunsden triumphed. His laugh announced victory. What the deuce are you laughing at, Mr. Hunsden? At your exemplary composure. Well, lad, I'll not bore you. I'll see how it is. Zoraide has jilted you, married someone richer, as any sensible woman would have done if she had had the chance. I made no reply. I let him think so, not feeling inclined to enter into an explanation of the real state of things, and as little to forge a false account. But it was not easy to blind Hunsden. My very silence, instead of convincing him that he had hit the truth, seemed to render him doubtful about it. He went on. I suppose the affair has been conducted as such affairs always are amongst rational people. You offered her your youth and your talents, such as they are, in exchange for her position and money. I don't suppose you took appearance or what is called love into the account, for I understand she is older than you, and Brown says rather sensible looking than beautiful. She, having then no chance of making a better bargain, was at first inclined to come to terms with you, but Pelé, the head of a flourishing school, stepped in with a higher bid. She accepted, and he has got her. A correct transaction, perfectly so, businesslike and legitimate. And now we'll talk of something else. Do, said I, very glad to dismiss the topic, and specially glad to have baffled the sagacity of my cross questioner, if indeed I had baffled it. For though his words now led away from the dangerous point, his eyes, keen and watchful, seemed still preoccupied with the former idea. You want to hear news from X? And what interest can you have in X? You left no friends there, for you made none. Nobody ever asks after you, neither man nor woman. And if I mention your name in company, the men look as if I had spoken of Prester John, and the women sneer covertly. Our ex-bells must have disliked you. How did you excite their displeasure? I don't know. I seldom spoke to them. They were nothing to me. I considered them only as something to be glanced at from a distance. Their dresses and faces were often pleasing enough to the eye, but I could not understand their conversation, nor even read their countenances. When I caught snatches of what they said, I could never make much of it, and the play of their lips and eyes did not help me at all. That was your fault, not theirs. That are sensible as well as handsome women in X. Women it is worth any man's while to talk to, and with whom I can talk with pleasure. But you had and have no pleasant address. There is nothing in you to induce a woman to be affable. I have remarked you sitting near the door in a room full of company, bent on hearing, not on speaking, on observing, not on entertaining, looking frigidly shy at the commencement of a party, confusingly vigilant about the middle, and insultingly weary towards the end. Is that the way, do you think, ever to communicate pleasure or excite interest? No. And if you're generally unpopular, it is because you deserve to be so. Content, I ejaculated. No, you are not content. You see beauty always turning its back on you. You are mortified and then you sneer. I verily believe all that is desirable on earth, wealth, reputation, love, will forever to you be the ripe grapes on the high trellis. You look up at them, they will tantalize in you the lust of the eye, but they are out of reach. You have not the address to fetch a letter, and you go away calling them sour. Cutting as these words might have been under some circumstances, they drew no blood now. My life was changed. My experience had been varied since I left X. But Hunsden could not know this. He had seen me only in the character of Mr. Crimsworth's clerk, a dependent amongst wealthy strangers, meeting disdain with a hard front, conscious of an unsocial and unattractive exterior, refusing to sue for notice which I was sure would be withheld, declining to evince an admiration which I knew would be scorned as worthless. He could not be aware that since then youth and loveliness had been to me everyday objects, that I had studied them at leisure and closely, and had seen the plain texture of truth under the embroidering of appearance. Nor could he, keen-sighted as he was, penetrate into my heart, search my brain, and read my peculiar sympathies and antipathies. He had not known me long enough or well enough to perceive how low my feelings would ebb under some influences, powerful over most minds, how high, how fast they would flow under other influences, that perhaps acted with the more intense force on me because they acted on me alone. Neither could he suspect for an instant the history of my communications with Mademoiselle Reuter. Secret to him and to all others was the tale of her strange infatuation. Her blandishments, her wiles, and had been seen but by me, and to me only were they known. But they had changed me, for they had proved that I could impress. A sweeter secret nestled deeper in my heart, one full of tenderness and as full of strength. It took the sting out of Hunston's sarcasm. It kept me unbent by shame and unstirred by wrath. But of all this I could say nothing. Nothing decisive, at least. Uncertainty sealed my lips, and during the interval of silence, by which alone I replied to Mr. Hunston, I made up my mind to be for the present wholly misjudged by him, and misjudged I was. He thought he had been rather too hard upon me, and that I was crushed by the weight of his upbraidings. So, to reassure me, he said, doubtless I should mend some day. I was only at the beginning of life yet, and since happily I was not quite without sense, every false step I made would be a good lesson. Just then I turned my face a little to the light. The approach of twilight and my position in the window seat had, for the last 10 minutes, prevented him from studying my countenance. As I moved, however, he caught an expression which he thus interpreted. Confound it, how doggedly self-approving the lad looks! I thought he was fit to die with shame, and there he sits, raining smiles, so good as to say, let the world wag as it will, I have the philosopher's stone in my waistcoat pocket, and the elixir of life in my cupboard. I am independent of both fate and fortune. Hunston, you spoke of grapes. I was thinking of a fruit I like better than your ex-hothouse grapes, an unique fruit, growing wild, which I have marked as my own and hope one day to gather and taste. It is of no use your offering me the draught of bitterness or threatening me with death by thirst. I have the anticipation of sweetness on my palate, the hope of freshness on my lips. I can reject the unsavory and endure the exhausting. For how long? Till the next opportunity for effort, and as the prize of success will be a treasure after my own heart, I'll bring bull strength to the struggle. Bad luck crushes bulls as easily as bullaces, and I believe the fury dogs you. You were born with a wooden spoon in your mouth, depend on it. I believe you, and I mean to make my wooden spoon do the work of some people's silver ladles. Grasped firmly and handled nimbly, even a wooden spoon will shovel up broth. Hunsden rose. I see, said he. I suppose you're one of those who develop best unwatched, and act best unaided, work your own way. Now I'll go. And without another word, he was going. At the door he turned. Crimsworth Hall is sold, said he. Sold, was my echo. Yes, you know, of course, that your brother failed 3 months ago. What, Edward Crimsworth? Precisely. And his wife went home to her father's. When affairs went awry, his temper sympathized with them. He used her ill. I told you he would be a tyrant to her some day. As to him, what has become of him? Nothing extraordinary. Don't be alarmed. He put himself under the protection of the court, compounded with his creditors. 10 pence in the pound. In 6 weeks set up again, coaxed back his wife, and is flourishing like a green bay tree. And Crimsworth Hall was the furniture sold to. Everything from the grand piano down to the rolling pin. And the contents of the oak dining room, were they sold? Of course. Why should the sofas and chairs of that room be held more sacred than those of any other? And the pictures? What pictures? Crimsworth had no special collection that I know of. He did not profess to be an amateur. There were 2 portraits, one on each side the mantelpiece. You cannot have forgotten them, Mr. Hunston. You once noticed that of the lady. Oh, I know. The thin-faced gentlewoman with a shawl put on like drapery. Why, as a matter of course, it would be sold among the other things. If you had been rich, you might have bought it, for I remember you said it represented your mother. You see what it is to be without a sou. I did. But surely, I thought to myself, I shall not always be so poverty-stricken. I may one day buy it back yet. Who purchased it? Do you know? I asked. How is it likely? I never inquired who purchased anything. There spoke the unpractical man, to imagine all the world is interested in what interests himself. Now, good night. I'm off for Germany tomorrow morning. I shall be back here in 6 weeks, and possibly I may call and see you again. I wonder whether you'll be still out of place. He laughed as mockingly, as heartlessly as Mephistopheles, and so laughing, vanished. Some people, however indifferent they may become after a considerable space of absence, always contrive to leave a pleasant impression just at parting. Not so Hunsden. A conference with him affected one like a draught of Peruvian bark. It seemed a concentration of the specially harsh, stringent, bitter. Whether like bark it invigorated, I scarcely knew. A ruffled mind makes a restless pillow. I slept little on the night after this interview. Towards morning I began to doze, but hardly had my slumber become sleep when I was roused from it by hearing a noise in my sitting room, to which my bedroom adjoined. A step and a shoving of furniture. The movement lasted barely 2 minutes. With the closing of the door, it ceased. I listened. Not a mouse stirred. Perhaps I had dreamt it. Perhaps a locataire had made a mistake and entered my apartment instead of his own. It was yet but 5 o'clock. Neither I nor the day were wide awake. I turned and was soon unconscious. When I did rise about 2 hours later, I had forgotten the circumstance. The first thing I saw, however, on quitting my chamber, recalled it. Just pushed in at the door of my sitting room, and still standing on end, was a wooden packing case. A rough deal affair, wide but shallow. A porter had doubtless shoved it forward, but seeing no occupant of the room, had left it at the entrance. That is none of mine, thought I, approaching. It must be meant for somebody else. I stooped to examine the address. William Crimsworth, St. Brussels. I was puzzled, but concluding that the best way to obtain information was to ask within, I cut the cords and opened the case. Green baize enveloped its contents, sewn carefully at the sides. I ripped the pack thread with my penknife, and still as the seam gave way, glimpses of gilding appeared through the widening interstices. Boards and baize being at length removed, I lifted from the case a large picture in a magnificent frame. Leaning it against a chair in a position where the light from the window fell favorably upon it, I stepped back. Already I had mounted my spectacles. A portrait painter's sky, the most sombre and threatening of welkins, and distant trees of a conventional depth of hue, raised in full relief a pale, pensive-looking female face, shadowed with soft dark hair, almost blending with the equally dark clouds. Large solemn eyes looked reflectively into mine. A thin cheek rested on a delicate little hand. A shawl, artistically draped, half hid, half showed a slight figure. A listener, had there been one, might have heard me, after 10 minutes' silent gazing, utter the word, "Mother." I might have said more, but with me the first word uttered aloud in soliloquy rouses consciousness. It reminds me that only crazy people talk to themselves, and then I think out of my monologue instead of speaking it. I had thought a long while, and a long while had contemplated the intelligence, the sweetness, and, alas, the sadness also of those fine grey eyes, the mental power of that forehead, and the rare sensibility of that serious mouth, when my glance, travelling downwards, fell on a narrow billet, stuck in the corner of the picture, between the frame and the canvas. Then I first asked, who sent this picture? Who thought of me, saved it out of the wreck of Crimsworth Hall, and now commits it to the care of its natural keeper? I took the note from its niche. Thus it spoke. So here's what the note said. There is a sort of stupid pleasure in giving a child sweets, a fool his bells, a dog a bone. You are repaid by seeing the child besmear his face with sugar, by witnessing how the fool's ecstasy makes a greater fool of him than ever, by watching the dog's nature come out over his bone. In giving William Crimsworth his mother's picture, I give him sweets, bells, and bone all in one. What grieves me is that I cannot behold the result. I would have added 5 shillings more to my bid if the auctioneer could only have promised me that pleasure. H.Y.H. So that came from Mr. Hunsden. P.S. You said last night you positively declined adding another item to your account with me. Don't you think I've saved you that trouble? I muffled the picture in its green baize covering, restored it to the case, and having transported the whole concern to my bedroom, put it out of sight under my bed. My pleasure was now poisoned by pungent pain. I determined to look no more till I could look at my ease. If Hansen had come in at that moment, I should have said to him, I owe you nothing, Hansen, not a fraction of a farthing. You have paid yourself in taunts. Too anxious to remain any longer quiescent, I had no sooner breakfasted than I repaired once more to Monsieur Vandenhutten's, scarcely hoping to find him at home, for a week had barely elapsed since my first call, the father of the boy whom he had saved. But fancying I might be able to glean information as to the time when his return was expected. A better result awaited me than I had anticipated, for though the family were yet at Ostend, Monsieur Vandenhutten had come over to Brussels on business for the day. He received me with the quiet kindness of a sincere though not excitable man. I had not sat 5 minutes alone with him in his bureau before I became aware of a sense of ease in his presence, such as I rarely experience with strangers. I was surprised at my own composure, for after all, I had come on business to me exceedingly painful, that of soliciting a favor. I asked on what basis the call rested. I feared it might be deceptive. Ere long I caught a glimpse of the ground, and at once I felt assured of its solidity. I knew where it was. Monsieur Vanderhunten was rich, respected, and influential. I, poor, despised, and powerless. So we stood to the world at large as members of the world's society. But to each other as a pair of human beings, our positions were reversed. The Dutchman, he was not Flamand but pure Hollandais, was slow, cool, of rather dense intelligence, though sound and accurate judgment. The Englishman, far more nervous, active, quicker both to plan and to practice, to conceive and to realize. The Dutchman was benevolent, the Englishman susceptible. In short, our characters dovetailed, but my mind, having more fire and action than his, instinctively assumed and kept the predominance. So this is quite interesting. In relation to social status and wealth, Monsieur Vandenhutten was the superior. But in relation to intellect and fire and action, William Crimsworth was the predominant. This point settled and my position well ascertained, I addressed him on the subject of my affairs with that genuine frankness which full confidence can alone inspire. It was a pleasure to him to be so appealed to. He thanked me for giving him the opportunity of using a little exertion in my behalf. I went on to explain to him that my wish was not so much to be helped as to be put into the way of helping myself. Of him I did not want exertion, that was to be my part, but only information and recommendation. Soon after I rose to go. He held out his hand at parting, an action of greater significance with foreigners than with Englishmen. As I exchanged a smile with him, I thought the benevolence of his truthful face was better than the intelligence of my own. Characters of my order experience a balm-like solace in the contact of such souls as animated the honest breast of Victor Vanderhunten. The next fortnight was a period of many alternations. My existence during its lapse resembled a sky of one of those autumnal nights which are specially haunted by meteors and falling stars. Hopes and fears, expectations and disappointments descended in glancing showers from zenith to horizon. But all were transient, and darkness followed swift each vanishing apparition. Monsieur Vanderhutton aided me faithfully. He set me on the track of several places, and himself made efforts to secure them for me. But for a long time solicitation and recommendation were in vain. The door either shut in my face when I was about to walk in, or another candidate entering before me rendered my further advance useless. Feverish and roused, no disappointment arrested me. Defeat following fast on defeat served as stimulants to will. I forgot fastidiousness, conquered reserve, thrust pride from me. I asked, I persevered, I remonstrated, I dunned. It is so that openings are forced into the guarded circle where fortune sits dealing favors round. My perseverance made me known, my importunity made me remarked. I was inquired about. My former pupils' parents, gathering the reports of their children, heard me spoken of as talented, and they echoed the word. The sound, bandied about at random, came at last to ears which, but for its universality, it might never have reached. And at the very crisis when I had tried my last effort and knew not what to do, Fortune, the capital F, looked in at me one morning, and as I sat in drear and almost desperate deliberation on my bedstead, nodded with the familiarity of an old acquaintance, though God knows I had never met her before, and threw a prize into my lap. In the second weekend of October 18 something, she does not add the exact date, I got the appointment of English professor to all the classes of College, Brussels, with a salary of 3,000 francs per annum, and the certainty of being able, by dint of the reputation and publicity accompanying the position, to make as much more by private means. The official notice, which communicated this information, mentioned also that it was the strong recommendation of Monsieur van der Hatten, negotiant, which had turned the scale of choice in my favor. No sooner had I read the announcement than I hurried to Monsieur van der Hatten's bureau, pushed the document under his nose, and when he had perused it, took both his hands and thanked him with unrestrained vivacity. My vivid words and emphatic gesture moved his Dutch calm to unwonted sensation. He said he was happy, glad to have served me, but he had done nothing meriting such thanks. He had not laid out a centime, only stretched a few words on a sheet of paper. Again I repeated to him, "You have made me quite happy, and in a way that suits me. I do not feel an obligation irksome, conferred by your kind hand. I do not feel disposed to shun you because you have done me a favor. From this day on, you must consent to admit me to your intimate acquaintance, for I shall hereafter recur again and again to the pleasure of your society." "Ainsi soit-il," was the reply, accompanied by a smile of benignant content. I went away with its sunshine in my heart. And that's the end of chapter 22. So he has finally got a position, and a very good position, by the help of the recommendation of Monsieur van der Hatten. And now he can finally do what his heart wishes to do, to ask Frances to marry him. So let's take a look at chapter 23, the last one we'll discuss today. It was 2 o'clock when I returned to my lodgings. My dinner, just brought in from a neighboring hotel, smoked on the table. I sat down thinking to eat. Had the plate been heaped with potsherd and broken glass instead of boiled beef and haricots, I could not have made a more signal failure. Appetite had forsaken me. Impatient of seeing food which I could not taste, I put it all aside into a cupboard and then demanded, "What shall I do till evening?" For before 6 p.m. it would be vain to seek the Rue Notre-Dame-aux-Neiges. Its inhabitant, for me it had but one, was detained by her vocation elsewhere. I walked in the streets of Brussels, and I walked in my own room from 2 o'clock till 6. Never once in that space of time did I sit down. I was in my chamber when the last named hour struck. I had just bathed my face and feverish hands, and was standing near the glass. My cheek was crimson, my eye was flame. Still all my features looked quite settled and calm. Descending swiftly the stair and stepping out, I was glad to see twilight drawing on in clouds. Such shade was to me like a grateful screen, and the chill of latter autumn, breathing in a fitful wind from the northwest, met me as a refreshing coolness. Still I saw it was cold to others, for the women I passed were wrapped in shawls, and the men had their coats buttoned close. When are we quite happy? Was I so then? No. An urgent and growing dread worried my nerves, and had worried them since the first moment good tidings had reached me. How was Frances? It was 10 weeks since I had seen her, 6 since I had heard from her, or of her. I had answered her letter by a brief note, friendly but calm, in which no mention of continued correspondence or further visits was made. At that hour my bark hung on the topmost curl of a wave of fate, and I knew not on what shoal the onward rush of the billow might hurl it. I would not then attach her destiny to mine by the slightest thread. If doomed to split on the rock or run aground on the sand bank, I was resolved no other vessel should share my disaster. But 6 weeks was a long time, and could it be that she was still well and doing well? Were not all sages agreed in declaring that happiness finds no climax on earth? Dared I think that but half a street now divided me from the full cup of contentment, the draught drawn from water said to flow only in heaven? I was at the door. I entered the quiet house. I mounted the stairs. The lobby was void and still, all the doors closed. I looked for the neat green mat. It lay duly in its place. So he goes to her house, right? Signal of hope, I said and advanced. But I will be a little calmer. I am not going to rush in and get up a scene directly. Forcibly staying my eager step, I paused on the mat. What an absolute hush! Is she in? Is anybody in? I demanded to myself. A little tinkle, as of cinders falling from a grate, replied. Of movement, a fire was gently stirred, and the slight rustle of life continuing, a step paced equably backwards and forwards in the apartment. Fascinated, I stood, more fixedly fascinated, when a voice rewarded the attention of my strained ear. So low, so self-addressed, I never fancied the speaker otherwise than alone. Solitude might speak thus in a desert or in the hall of a forsaken house. So Francis is singing. Let's hear. And never but once, my son, he said, was yon dark cavern trod, in persecution's iron days, when the land was left by God. From Booley's bog with slaughter red, a wanderer hither drew, and oft he stopped and turned his head, as by fits the night winds blew. For trampling round by Cheviot edge were heard the troopers keen, and frequent from the Whitelaw ridge the death shot flashed between, etc., etc. This is a Scottish ballad by Sir Walter Scott. The old Scotch ballad was partly recited, then dropped. A pause ensued, then another strain followed in French, of which the purport translated ran as follows. I gave at first attention close, that interest warm ensued. From interest, as improvement rose, succeeded gratitude. Obedience was no effort soon, and labor was no pain. If tired, a word, a glance alone would give me strength again. From others of the studious band, ere long he singled me, but only by more close demand and sterner urgency. The task he from another took, from me he did reject. He would no slight omission brook, and suffer no defect. If my companions went astray, he scarce their wanderings blamed. If I but faltered in the way, his anger fiercely flamed. And you can tell that this poem, it is about her relationship with William as her master, right? Her teacher, her professor. Something stirred in an adjoining chamber. It would not do to be surprised eavesdropping. I tapped hastily, and as hastily entered. Frances was just before me. She had been walking slowly in her room, and her step was checked by my advent. Twilight only was with her, and tranquil, ruddy firelight. To this sister, the bright and the dark, she had been speaking, ere I entered in poetry. Sir Walter Scott's voice, to her a foreign, far-off sound, a mountain echo, had uttered itself in the first stanzas. The second, I thought, from the style and the substance, was the language of her own heart. Yes, she wrote it herself. Her face was grave, its expression concentrated. She bent on me an unsmiling eye, and I just returning from abstraction, just awaking from dreams. Well arranged was her simple attire, smooth her dark hair, orderly her tranquil room. But what, with her thoughtful look, her serious self-reliance, her bent to meditation, happily inspiration, what had she to do with love? Nothing, was the answer of her own sad, though gentle countenance. It seemed to say, I must cultivate fortitude and cling to poetry. One is to be my support and the other my solace through life. Human affections do not bloom, nor do human passions glow for me. Other women have such thoughts. Frances, had she been as desolate as she deemed, would not have been worse off than thousands of her sex. Look at the rigid and formal race of old maids, the race whom all despise. They have fed themselves from youth upwards on maxims of resignation and endurance. Many of them get ossified with a dry diet. Self-control is so continually their thought, so perpetually their object, that at last it absorbs the softer and more agreeable qualities of their nature, and they die mere models of austerity, fashioned out of a little parchment and much bone. Anatomists will tell you that there is a heart in the withered old maid's carcass, the same as in that of any cherished wife or proud mother in the land. Can this be so? I really don't know, but feel inclined to doubt it. This is so this is so harsh, right? Of course, an old maid has a heart, but yeah, conventions at the time perhaps um, limited a woman so much that if she did not become a mother or a wife, she would have to um, become more and more of a recluse and shut herself in and ossify, like he says. And he thought maybe that would be the fate of Francis. I came forward, bade Frances good evening, and took my seat. The chair I had chosen was one she had probably just left. It stood by a little table where were her open desk and papers. I know not whether she had fully recognized me at first, but she did so now, and in a voice soft but quiet she returned my greeting. I had shown no eagerness. She took her cue from me and evinced no surprise. We met as we had always met, as master and pupil, nothing more. I proceeded to handle the papers. Francis, observant and serviceable, stepped into an inner room, brought a candle, lit it, placed it by me, then drew the curtain over the lattice, and having added a little fresh fuel to the already bright fire, she drew a second chair to the table and sat down at my right hand, a little removed. The paper on the top was a translation of some grave French author into English, but underneath lay a sheet with stanzas. On this I laid hands. Francis half rose, made a movement to recover the captured spoil, saying, "That was nothing, a mere copy of verses." I put by resistance with the decision I knew she never long opposed. But on this occasion her fingers had fastened on the paper. I had quietly to unloose them. Their hold dissolved to my touch. Her hand shrunk away. My own would fain have followed it, but for the present I forbade such impulse. The first page of the sheet was occupied with the lines I had overheard. The sequel was not exactly the writer's own experience, but a composition by portions of that experience suggested. Thus, while egotism was avoided, the fancy was exercised and the heart satisfied. I translate as before, and my translation is nearly literal, continued thus. When sickness stayed a while my course, he seemed impatient still, because his pupil's flagging force could not obey his will. So now she's imagining, right, what if scenario between the master, the professor, and the pupil. One day, when summoned to the bed where pain and I did strive, I heard him, as he bent his head, say, "God, she must revive." I felt his hand with gentle stress a moment laid on mine, and wished to mark my consciousness by some responsive sign. But powerless then to speak or move, I only felt within the sense of hope, the strength of love, their healing work begin. And as he from the room withdrew, my heart his steps pursued. I longed to prove by efforts new my speechless gratitude. When once again I took my place, long vacant in the class, the infrequent smile across his face did for one moment pass. The lesson done, the signal made of glad release and play, he as he passed an instant stayed, one kindly word to say. "Jane, till tomorrow you are free from tedious task and rule. This afternoon I must not see that yet pale face in school. Sick in the garden shades a seat, far from the playground din. The sun is warm, the air is sweet. Stay till I call you in." A long and pleasant afternoon I passed in those green bowers, all silent, tranquil, and alone, with birds and bees and flowers. Yet when my master's voice I heard call from the window, "Jane," I entered, joyful at the word, the busy house again. He in the hall paced up and down. He paused as I passed by. His forehead stern relaxed its frown. He raised his deep-set eye. "Not quite so pale," he murmured low. "Now, Jane, go rest awhile. and as I smiled, his smoothened brow returned as glad a smile. My perfect health restored, he took his mien austere again, and as before he would not brook the slightest fault from Jane. The longest task, the hardest theme, fell to my share as erst, and still I toiled to place my name in every study first. He yet begrudged and stinted praise, but I had learned to read the secret meaning of his face, and that was my best meed. Even when his hasty temper spoke in tones that sorrow stirred, my grief was lulled as soon as woke by some relenting word. And when he lent some precious book, or gave some fragrant flower, I did not quail to envy's look, upheld by pleasure's power. At last our school ranks took their ground, the hard-fought field I won, the prize a laurel wreath was bound my throbbing forehead on. Low at my master's knee I bent, the offered crown to meet. Its green leaves through my temples sent a thrill as wild as sweet. The strong pulse of ambition struck in every vein I owned. At the same instant bleeding broke a secret inward wound. The hour of triumph was to me the hour of sorrow sore. A day hence I must cross the sea, never to recross it more. An hour hence in my master's room I with him sat alone, and told him what a dreary gloom over joy had parting thrown. He little said, the time was brief, the ship was soon to sail, and while I sobbed in bitter grief, my master but looked pale. They called in haste, he bade me go, then snatched me back again. He held me fast and murmured low, when will they part us, Jane? Were you not happy in my care? Did I not faithful prove? Will others to my darling bear as true, as deep a love? O God, watch over my foster child. O guard her gentle head. When minds are high and tempests wild, protection round her spread. They call again, leave then my breast. Quit thy true shelter, Jane, but when deceived, repulsed, oppressed, come home to me again. I read, then dreamily made marks on the margin with my pencil, thinking all the while of other things, thinking that Jane was now at my side. Indeed, Jane of the poem was Frances. She was writing about her own feelings. No child but a girl of 19, and she might be mine, so my heart affirmed. Poverty's curse was taken off me. Envy and jealousy were far away and unapprised of this our quiet meeting. The frost of the master's manner might melt. I felt the thaw coming fast, whether I would or not. No further need for the eye to practice a hard look, for the brow to compress its expanse into a stern fold. It was now permitted to suffer the outward revelation of the inward glow, to seek, demand, elicit an answering ardor. While musing thus, I thought that the grass on Hermon never drank the fresh dews of sunset more gratefully than my feelings drank the bliss of this hour. Frances rose, as if restless. She passed before me to stir the fire, which did not want stirring. She lifted and put down the little ornaments on the mantelpiece. Her dress waved within a yard of me. Slight, straight, and elegant, she stood erect on the hearth. There are impulses we can control, but there are others which control us, because they attain us with a tiger leap and are our masters ere we have seen them. Perhaps though such impulses are seldom altogether bad, perhaps reason, capital R, by a process as brief as quiet, a process that is finished ere felt, has ascertained the sanity of the deed instinct meditates, and feels justified in remaining passive while it is performed. I know I did not reason, I did not plan or intend, yet, whereas one moment I was sitting solus on the chair near the table, the next I held Frances on my knee, placed there with sharpness and decision, and retained with exceeding tenacity. Monsieur, cried Frances, and was still. Not another word escaped her lips. Sorely confounded she seemed during the lapse of the first few moments, but the amazement soon subsided. Terror did not succeed, nor fury. After all, she was only a little nearer than she had ever been before, to one she habitually respected and trusted. Embarrassment might have impelled her to contend, but self-respect checked resistance where resistance was useless. Frances, how much regard have you for me? Was my demand. No answer. The situation was yet too new and surprising to permit speech. On this consideration, I compelled myself for some seconds to tolerate her silence, though impatient of it. Presently, I repeated the same question. Probably not in the calmest of tones. She looked at me. My face doubtless was no model of composure, my eyes no still wells of tranquillity. Do speak, I urged, and a very low, hurried, yet still arch voice said, Monsieur, vous me faites mal. De grâce, lâchez un peu ma main droite. In truth, I became aware that I was holding the said main droite, the right hand, in a somewhat ruthless grasp. I did as desired, and for the third time asked more gently, Francis, how much regard have you for me? Mon maître, je n'ai beaucoup, was the truthful rejoinder. Francis, have you enough to give yourself to me as my wife, to accept me as your husband? I felt the agitation of the heart. I saw the purple light of love cast its glowing reflection on cheeks, temples, neck. I desired to consult the eye, but sheltering lash and lid forbade. Monsieur, said the soft voice at last, Monsieur désire savoir si je consens, si enfin, si je veux me marier avec lui? Justement. Monsieur sera-t-il aussi bon mari qu'il a été bon maître? She asks if he will be as good a husband as he has been a professor. I will try, Francis. A pause. Then, with a new yet still subdued inflection of the voice, an inflection which provoked while it pleased me, accompanied too by a sourire à la fois fin et timide, in perfect harmony with the tone. C'est-à-dire, monsieur sera toujours un peu entêté, exigeant, volontaire? Have I been so, Francis? Mais oui, vous le savez bien. Have I been nothing else? Mais oui, vous avez été mon meilleur ami. You have been my best friend. And what, Francis, are you to me? Votre dévoué élève qui vous aime de tout son cœur. So she's a devoted student. Will my pupil consent to pass her life with me? Speak English now, Francis. Some moments were taken for reflection. The answer pronounced slowly ran thus. You have always made me happy. I like to hear you speak. I like to see you. I like to be near you. I believe you are very good and very superior. I know you are stern to those who are careless and idle, but you are kind, very kind to the attentive and industrious, even if they are not clever. Master, I should be glad to live with you always. And she made a sort of movement, as if she would have clung to me, but restraining herself, she only added with earnest emphasis, Master, I consent to pass my life with you. Very well, Francis. I drew her a little nearer to my heart. I took a first kiss from her lips, thereby sealing the compact. The compact, as if a business deal, right? Now framed between us. Afterwards, she and I were silent, nor was our silence brief. Francis' thoughts during this interval I know not, nor did I attempt to guess them. I was not occupied in searching her countenance, nor in otherwise troubling her composure. The peace I felt, I wished her to feel. My arm, it is true, still detained her, but with a restraint that was gentle enough, so long as no opposition tightened it. My gaze was on the red fire. My heart was measuring its own content. It sounded and found a depth fathomless. Monsieur, at last said my quiet companion, as stirless in her happiness as a mouse in its terror. Even now in speaking, she scarcely lifted her head. Well, Francis, I like unexaggerated intercourse. It is not my way to overpower with amorous epithets, any more than to worry with selfishly importunate caresses. Monsieur est raisonnable, n'est-ce pas? Yes, especially when I am requested to be so in English. But why do you ask me? You see nothing vehement or obtrusive in my manner. Am I not tranquil enough? Ce n'est pas cela, began Francis. English, I reminded her. Well, monsieur, I wished merely to say that I should like, of course, to retain my employment of teaching. You will teach still, I suppose, monsieur? Oh, yes, it is all I have to depend on. Bon, good. Thus we shall have both the same profession. I like that. And my efforts to get on will be as unrestrained as yours. Will they not, monsieur? You are laying plans to be independent of me, said I. Yes, monsieur, I must be no encumbrance to you, no burden in any way. But Francis, I have not yet told you what my prospects are. I have left Monsieur Bellet's, and after nearly a month seeking, I have got another place, with a salary of 3,000 francs a year, which I can easily double by a little additional exertion. Thus, you see, it would be useless for you to fag yourself by going out to give lessons. On 6,000 francs, you and I can live, and live well. Francis seemed to consider it. There is something flattering to man's strength, something consonant to his honorable pride in the idea of becoming the providence of what he loves, feeding and clothing it, as God does the lilies of the field. So, to decide her resolution, I went on. Life has been painful and laborious enough to you so far, Francis. You require complete rest. Your 1,200 francs would not form a very important addition to our income. And what sacrifice of comfort to earn it! Relinquish your labors. You must be weary, and let me have the happiness of giving you rest. I'm not sure whether Frances had accorded due attention to my harangue. Instead of answering me with her usual respectful promptitude, she only sighed and said, "How rich you are, monsieur!" And then she stirred uneasy in my arms. 3,000 francs, she murmured, while I get only 1,200. She went on faster. However, it must be so for the present. And monsieur, were you not saying something about my giving up my place? Oh, no, I shall hold it fast. And her little fingers emphatically tightened on mine. Think of my marrying you to be kept by you, monsieur. I could not do it. And how dull my days would be. You would be away teaching in close, noisy schoolrooms from morning till evening, and I should be lingering at home, unemployed and solitary. I should get depressed and sullen, and you would soon tire of me. Francis, you could read and study, two things you like so well. Monsieur, I could not. I like a contemplative life, but I like an active life better. I must act in some way, and act with you. I have taken notice, monsieur, that people who are only in each other's company for amusement never really like each other so well, or esteem each other so highly as those who work together and perhaps suffer together. You speak God's truth, said I at last, and you shall have your own way, for it is the best way. Now, as a reward for such ready consent, give me a voluntary kiss. So I think it's very nice that she wants to keep her independence and she wants to continue working and teaching to get her own money, despite the fact that William said he could provide for them both. After some hesitation, natural to a novice in the art of kissing, she brought her lips into very shy and gentle contact with my forehead. I took the small gift as a loan and repaid it promptly and with generous interest. I know not whether Frances was really much altered since the time I first saw her, but as I looked at her now, I felt that she was singularly changed for me. The sad eye, the pale cheek, the dejected and joyless countenance I remembered as her early attributes were quite gone. And now I saw a face dressed in graces, smile, dimple, and rosy tint rounded its contours and brightened its hues. I had been accustomed to nurse a flattering idea that my strong attachment to her proved some particular perspicacity in my nature. She was not handsome, she was not rich, she was not even accomplished, yet was she my life's treasure. I must then be a man of peculiar discernment. Tonight my eyes opened on the mistake I had made. I began to suspect that it was only my tastes which were unique, not my power of discovering and appreciating the superiority of moral worth over physical charms. For me, Frances had physical charms. In her, there was no deformity to get over, none of those prominent defects of eyes, teeth, complexion, shape, which hold at bay the admiration of the boldest male champions of intellect. For women can love a downright ugly man if he be but talented. Had she been either édentée, myope, rugueuse, or bossue, my feelings toward her might still have been kindly, but they could never have been impassioned. I had affection for the poor little misshapen Sylvie, but for her I could never have had love. It is true, Frances' mental points had been the first to interest me, and they still retained the strongest hold on my preference. But I liked the graces of her person too. So it's a combination of intellectual and physical attraction, right? Which is good. I derived a pleasure purely material from contemplating the clearness of her brown eyes, the fairness of her fine skin, the purity of her well-set teeth, the proportion of her delicate form, and that pleasure I could ill have dispensed with. It appeared then that I too was a sensualist in my temperate and fastidious way. Now, reader, during the last 2 pages I have been giving you honey fresh from flowers, but you must not live entirely on food so luscious. Taste then a little gall, just a drop by way of change. At a somewhat late hour I returned to my lodgings, having temporarily forgotten that men had any such coarse cares as those of eating and drinking. I went to bed fasting. I had been excited and in action all day, and had tasted no food since 8 that morning. Besides, for a fortnight past I had known no rest either of body or mind. The last few hours had been a sweet delirium. It would not subside now, and still long after midnight broke with troubled ecstasy the rest I so much needed. At last I dozed, but not for long. It was yet quite dark when I awoke, and my waking was like that of Job when a spirit passed before his face, and like him the hair of my flesh stood up. Foreboding mood now. I might continue the parallel, for in truth, though I saw nothing, yet a thing was secretly brought unto me, and mine ear received a little thereof. There was silence, and I heard a voice saying, in the midst of life, we are in death. That sound and the sensation of chill anguish accompanying it, many would have regarded as supernatural. But I recognize it as once as the effect of reaction. Man is ever clogged with his mortality, and it was my mortal nature which now faltered and plained, my nerves which jarred and gave a false sound, because the soul of late rushing headlong to an aim had overstrained the body's comparative weakness. A horror of great darkness fell upon me. I felt my chamber invaded by one I had known formerly, but had thought for ever departed. I was temporarily a prey to hypochondria. So that's interesting. When everything is going well, he gets tormented by his own mind. So he had exerted his body for so long, trying to find a new place to work, finding a solution so that he could ask Frances to marry him, asking her, receiving the positive answer. Now he could finally rest, and then he cannot. His mind becomes the enemy. That's quite a modern thing, right? She had been my acquaintance, hypochondria, nay, my guest, once before in boyhood. I had entertained her at bed and board for a year. For that space of time I had her to myself in secret. She lay with me, she ate with me, she walked out with me, showing me nooks in woods, hollows in hills, where we could sit together, and where she could drop her drear veil over me, and so hide sky and sun, grass and green tree, taking me entirely to her death-cold bosom, and holding me with arms of bone. So he would be veiled by depression, right? What tales she would tell me at such hours, this irrational fear. What songs she would recite in my ears, how she would discourse to me of her own country, the grave, and again promise to conduct me there ere long, and drawing me to the very brink of a black sullen river, show me on the other side shores unequal with monument and tablet, standing up in a glimmer more hoary than moonlight. Necropolis, she would whisper, pointing to the pale piles, and add, it contains a mansion prepared for you. But my boyhood was lonely, parentless, uncheered by a brother or sister, and there was no marvel that just as I rose to youth, a sorceress, finding me lost in vague mental wanderings, with many affections and few objects, glowing aspirations and gloomy prospects, strong desires and slender hopes, should lift up her elusive lamp to me in the distance, and lure me to her vaulted home of horrors. No wonder her spells then had power. But now, when my course was widening, my prospect brightening, when my affections had found rest, when my desires, folding wings, weary with long flight, had just alighted on the very lap of fruition, and nestled there warm, content, under the caress of a soft hand, why did hypochondria accost me now? I think this is very interesting, although a bit out of character at this point in the narrative, almost at the end. I think it would have been interesting if Charlotte Brontë had showed us glimpses of this side of William before, so then it would not seem so random and out of place at this point in the narrative. I don't know if you agree with me. Let's continue. I repulsed her as one would a dreaded and ghastly concubine coming to embitter her husband's heart toward his young bride. In vain, she kept her sway over me for that night and the next day, and 8 succeeding days. Afterwards, my spirits began slowly to recover their tone, my appetite returned, and in a fortnight I was well. I had gone about as usual all the time and had said nothing to anybody of what I felt. But I was glad when the evil spirit departed from me, and I could again seek Frances and sit at her side, freed from the dreadful tyranny of my demon. And that's the end of chapter 23. And that's what happens, right, when we're about to change something very big in our lives, which in the case of William was to enter marriage. um we are sometimes affected by this rational and irrational fears, a combination, his the tyranny of his demon, as he said. So it's quite interesting that Charlotte Bronte brings this to discussion, although a bit out of place, I feel, um, in William's character at this point of the narrative. So here we go. I hope you've enjoyed this session. Next time in our session number 10, that's our last session, we're going to finish reading The Professor together. We're going to read chapters 24 and 25. And I will see you then next week at our same time and same place at 1 o'clock p.m. Central European Summertime now on YouTube. Have a lovely week, and I'll see you then.